Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here is another of the series of discussion videos that Doris of Aldi Books and I are doing on the Faber stories. Individually bound stories to commemorate Faber's 90th birthday. And this one is by David Means, A River in Egypt. I didn't immediately recognize his name, so it wasn't until I started to research who David Means was that I realized he was the author of Histopia, his first and only novel, and it was nominated for the Man Booker Prize in 2016. And I remember hearing a lot about it at the time, and I've never read alternative historical fiction before, but I was kind of intrigued. I never got to it, and it's gone off my radar. So it didn't win the Man Booker. I don't remember if it was shortlisted or no, just longlisted according to Wikipedia. So Means was born in Michigan in 1961, and he is a short story writer and novelist, and he lives in Nyack, New York. Nyack. He's not really famous. I'm interested that he's been chosen for this series because he's not that well known. Although I see here that some have compared his short fiction to that of Raymond Carver and Alice Munro. But he's kind of more like an up-and-coming writer than a famous one, but that's interesting. So because he's not that famous, there's not that much about him online, but that's what I found out. So I am really intrigued by this story. I like the writing very much. I don't know what to make of it. It's crazy and kind of emotional and wacky at the same time. So the man, Kavanaugh, is visiting his son, who's a young boy, very young, 5 or 6 or 7, because he's very much at the toy stage, who's getting a test at the hospital, and it sounds really serious. We don't have much information about it, but they are in a sweat chamber, which apparently is required in order to administer the test, and that's all we know. Harrison is an assistant art director, known for his last-minute design fixes, and he's just recently, that same morning, got fired from a big-budget sci-fi movie because his designs were too perfect. And in trying to explain why he's getting fired as diplomatically as possible, the director, or whoever he is, goes on quite a riff about the present and the past and the future and all that stuff. And I don't know how or if that is going to resonate in the story at large, but I am going to keep that in my mind as I finish the story because it's really quite intriguing. Just one sentence. You see, my hope is to keep... This is the director who's in the process of firing Kavanaugh. You see, my hope is to keep the film, for all its futuristic overtones, closely rooted in the present moment. And that way, as I see it, the audience will feel connected to contemporary experience in a way that will allow the obvious eternal elements. So, is that just in there by chance, or is that going to resonate throughout the story? If it's a good short story, nothing, including that sentence, should be in it without a good reason, or without some literarily important meaning. So, and then the whole thing about toys, and he and his wife have been kind of squabbling about not giving their son too many toys or new toys, and so he kind of tries to recycle the toys that he gives to his young son while they're waiting for the test, so that he will think they're new even though he just played with them 10 minutes before, and that doesn't work for the boy, and the boy just shrieks at the top of his lungs. And so I've read to the section break at the bottom of page 10, and that's what's happened. I don't know what it all means. The stories don't have to have a meaning, or at least not one that can be articulated, certainly not with my mediocre abilities in that area. But I don't know where it's going or what it's going to end up being about. What's the title? A River in Egypt. But I am really intrigued, so that's what I have. I'm dying to know what you got out of the first 10 pages.
Well, Shawn, if you really want to know what I think this kid is a spoiled brat. But I'm trying to maintain an open mind as he is in the hospital for a test, and we don't know what his circumstances are, but earlier parts of the story lead me to believe that this is not a new development, the bratty part at least. But I did love that last line before that break, when the kid's like squalling. This was a cry that rent open the universe, and in doing so, peeled back and exposed some soft, vulnerable tissue in Kavanaugh's brain. Yeah. When have we not heard a child scream, and especially as a parent, like felt that cringe, like out in public? Anyway, I did really love your point though about the art director talking about the contemporary and the eternal, and how that needed to be relevant in the story for it to be a good short story. So I'm eager to see how that thought that you mentioned plays out in here. Yes. And I did peek ahead to the next line, and I'm intrigued about this act of self-preservation and how that would lead into the future. So, where are we going with this? The writing, though, I'm not sold on it. He's got so many of those inserts, inserted with commas or dashes, that, good Lord, I can hardly breathe mentally reading these long, clunky sentences. So, maybe I just had to get in the rhythm of it, because by page 10 I was kind of okay with it, but initially I was like, dude, break it up a little. Anyway, yeah, fingers crossed for this one. I'm not so sure, but maybe.
Hey Doris, well, I didn't end up liking it. Too bad, 2 stars. I was glad you talked about the writing. I was kind of taken with it at first, didn't really notice it. I kind of like verbose prose in small doses, but once you mentioned it, I really didn't experience anything else other than how pedantic the writing was. This was a story about a deeply emotional topic, and it failed almost utterly because of the writing. It wasn't just the length of the sentences, but about the stuck up in his headness of the protagonist, which was made manifest by the way this story was written. So no, I was really disappointed. I didn't think that the whole thing about locating the future in the present and as a way of tapping into the eternal was successful at all. I kind of got how that did weave itself through the story in terms of waiting for a diagnosis, and then there was a delay in getting the diagnosis, and there was some stuff about looking into the future through all of that, but it was so intellectual, and this was about such an emotional experience. So I'd have to say the one good thing I will say is, just like you identified that sentence at the end of section 1 as being quite beautiful, I thought the very ending, which I think is the only time other than the child's scream that the child speaks, the last line or lines of this story are the child speaking, and I thought that was quite powerful in sharp contrast to the rest. The scene with the psychiatrist was just ridiculous and just distanced me so far from what should have been a deeply heartfelt story. And all of the other stuff that happened in the last 2/3 of this story, just, I felt so removed. So I want to close by looking back at the sentence that I read, I've commented on, but then if you follow that onto the top of page 3, the same speech where the director is firing this protagonist Kavanaugh, the director says, "So the trick to fostering believability lies in tweaking the extremely fine fissure between the known present and the unknowable future. If it's tweaked correctly, even years from now, an audience will ignore the errors and focus only on the viable world that had once really existed and still exists in all human interaction." That's well said, that's well written, but it is pretty heady. And again, I can trace that through to what the waiting for the diagnosis and all that, but it was not tweaked correctly. And I could not ignore the errors of over-intellectualizing this story. And I also want to go back to the sentence that you quoted, which I agree with you. God damn it. A little bug crawling on this. I agree with you that it was a fine sentence. The boys cry, rent open the universe, and in doing so, peeled back and exposed some soft, vulnerable tissue in Kavanaugh's brain. So we saw him being vulnerable, but it just didn't work for me because it was not enough. It was not soft and vulnerable enough for all that heady, intellectual mumble-jumble that it was bookended by. So, yeah, I was just very disappointed. I don't think I want to read his novel. Alternative history sounds overly intellectual. That's why I've never bothered to try a novel that's an alternative history. And now that I've read this by him, I think that's the kind of writing he does, and I'm not interested. I never did get the title, did you? They're driving by a body of water. Was it a river? But it certainly wasn't in Egypt. So maybe I missed something there, and you're going to fill me in, aren't you?
Hey, Shawn. No bueno. I agree. 2 stars is too many. This was definitely a disappointment. Sorry to spoil your enjoyment of the verbosity, but I think you would have gotten there on your own, like, in the next paragraph. It was just too much, wasn't it? And I think you completely hit the nail on the head. This was such an emotional topic. I was right there at that break, that sentence after the break. I was feeling like such a horrible person for judging this father with his child and calling him a spoiled brat. And that was the moment for the author to take my feelings and where he had gone with them and use it to inform me. But no, I just ended up feeling like he was playing with my emotions. With the nurse, she comes in and the guy's having this mental discussion with himself about whether or not she's judging him and whether or not she's going to turn him into child services. And you know, you got this running dialogue about the nurse. I don't know if we were in his head or the nurse's head, but I think we were in the nurse's head, in his head. But she goes back and forth, and you never know which side of the fence she's on. She goes back and forth and then back again. And then the bit with the psychiatrist, that was a conversation with the psychiatrist in the guy's head. This guy is like navel gazing way too much in this book, and I just couldn't handle it. I never knew where I was supposed to go. This guy was just all over the place. So yeah, I didn't feel bad at the end because the book just, it didn't have a clear direction that it conveyed to me. Yeah. So the river in Egypt, the topic, that was in the very beginning with that little question cube game where he, like, it was like a magic 8-ball but with quiz questions. So what river is in Egypt? The Nile, the Hudson, the Thames, or the Kalamazoo? That was that. But I never, you were right, at the end he was crossing a river, and all those flipping timestamps, what was that about? Like him putting time with everything. He was just, to me, conveying how unemotional that he was over this emotional topic, and maybe that was the point, but it didn't say anything to me overall. So yeah, hopefully the next pick will be a winner, because I think we've had 2 duds in a row now. Oh no. Anyway, on to the next. Yeah, fingers crossed it's a good one, okay? Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and chatting with us, and we will be back soon with number 12. Bye.